and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Somi Sorang with our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the program. Thank you for being here. Now this week, we'll continue on with our discussion of the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, focusing on the future outlook of inter-Korean relations, as well as the roles that the neighboring regional powers have. Now, inter-Korean dialogue and cooperation, as they're continuing to grow, in August 13th, an agreement was reached to hold the third inter-Korean summit.
지금처럼 화기애애한 분위기 속에서 서로 만나서 이야기를 주고받고 대화가 진행된다는 것은 소통이 된다는 걸 의미합니다. 마음이 어간다는 것은 곧 하나의 행동을 낳게 하는 그런 전제가 조성됐다는 걸 의미하지 않겠습니까? 이제는 서로가 서로의 뜻을 거스르지 않고 함께 손잡고 나가는 시대가 됐구나.
북측의 여러 가지 또 일정들, 상황들 그런 걸 감안할 때 일단 9월 안에 평양에서 한다 정도로 해놓고 구체적인 날짜는 좀 더 그런 여러 가지 상황들을 보면서.
And this time, President Moon Jae-in is to move up north to Pyongyang for the meeting. What do you think will be discussed during that meeting?
Well, I think there'll be a number of things on the agenda. Firstly, it'll be inter-Korean exchanges and cooperation. North Korea is particularly going to be looking for South Korea to go along with greater economic cooperation. There's talk of the connection of the railways. There's also the Gaesong Industrial Complex and the Mount Gungang tours. Those might come up. So they're more interested in developing not just cultural and sports exchanges, but economic cooperation with North Korea. South Korea has the challenge that North Korea is still subject to a number of sanctions and United Nations Security Council sanctions, US sanctions, and South Korea is also, obliged with its alliance with the U.S. to carry out those sanctions. So that will be problematic.
So speaking of the economic exchanges that you mentioned in the first half of your reply, when do you suppose that the Gaesong Industrial Complex would reopen and the Mount Kumgang tourism project will resume?
There's a lot of speculation. You had the head of Hyundai recently come out and say that the Kumgang Mountain Resort would open in the near future. But as Frank was saying, the issue of sanctions and South Korea's enforcement of those sanctions continues to be an incredible obstacle to all of these economic plans at this point. We see this impending collide coming between the Trump administration and the two Koreas, basically, sure, because both of them want to expand their economic exchange. And President Moon tried to turn the equation on its head. He said rather than denuclearization driving improved relations, he believes that improving inter-Korean relations will drive the denuclearization process.
So definitely some issues there with the sanctions. So let's talk about the international sanctions placed on North Korea. On August 4th, the United Nations released a report accusing North Korea of circumventing UN economic sanctions to illegally purchase oil products at sea without suspending its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. And on the same day, the United States imposed a set of unilateral sanctions targeting the regime in Pyongyang. Frank, this is a difficult question, but how much longer do you think the UN and the US should keep the sanctions on North Korea?
That is a really difficult question. I think that when we think about North Korea and its nuclear capabilities, we need to recognize that it's hard for the international community to really recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. It still doesn't have some critical technology. It still doesn't have re-entry technology for an intercontinental ballistic missile. It doesn't have the guidance system. It's not a de facto nuclear power state in terms of its ability to deliver an ICBM to a specific point in the United States. It uses that as rhetoric for its own government. But in terms of relief from sanctions, there are a number of things that North Korea does in terms of human rights, in terms of other international behaviors that the international community and especially the United States don't like. So for there to be relief from sanctions and to satisfy the US on that is going to be a very, very long-term process. Full relief from sanctions, there's going to need to be, in my view, a shift in the US position and an acceptance at some point, not made verbally, but made behind the scenes, that the US will accept no missile tests, no long-range missile tests, nothing flying over Japan or anything like that, and no nuclear tests. I think that if the US can find a way to behind the scenes accept those things, then you might be able to develop some concept of denuclearization that could lead to relief from sanctions.
Okay. Now, the United States has proposed Vietnam's economic model as a possible blueprint for North Korea to follow.
President Trump believes your country can replicate this path. It's yours if you'll seize the moment. The miracle can be yours. It can be your miracle in North Korea as well.
Vietnam saw remarkable economic growth following its normalization of diplomatic ties with the US. And after cultivating its agriculture and light industry sectors, its heavy industry sector also grew with the help of foreign investments. And now the annual GDP growth has hit the 7% mark for Vietnam, making it one of the world's fastest growing economies. So Pham, do you believe Vietnam's model is suitable for North Korea?
Yes, personally I think that Vietnam economic growth model is very suitable for North Korea. They can be socialist-oriented market economies, like the case of Vietnam. Not totally liberalization on the economic sector, putting some major economic sector under state control, step by step liberalize the economies. Yes, I think it's the best way for them.
So it's a possible way to emulate.
There's obviously a lot of conditions that would have to be put in place before you could start to emulate that Vietnamese model, including normalization of relations with the U.S. and Vietnam is a WTO member. But there was an interesting op-ed piece by Joseph Yun, who was the former top diplomat for the U.S. for dealing with North Korea. And he suggested sort of a preliminary stage, something like opening a liaison office in Pyongyang, from Washington opening one in Pyongyang and vice versa. And that kind of situation actually occurred in Vietnam before they normalized relations. So maybe some intermediate steps could help move that process forward.
Sure. Now, within North Korea, the North Korea stance is undergoing small but notable changes in light of improving ties with South Korea. It has put up photographs of South Korean President Jae-in and US President Donald Trump at its embassy in China, while returning the remains of 55 fallen US soldiers from the Korean War, which was then announced to the North Korean public 10 days later. Fabian, how do you think the average North Korean citizen is reacting to these events?
Yeah, I mean, it's very top-down, right? I mean, you cannot really freely express your political opinion about things. So I think that most North Koreans will just, go with what the regime says. And the regime is also very good at, spinning things. Like now, Trump is basically portrayed in a very, very good light. Just several months ago, he was the evil, imperialist. I don't think that many North Koreans will question that, at least not in public.
Especially when we look at the Singapore summit. I remember watching the summit take place and seeing the North Korean media following Kim's movements. And then the night walk that he took with dignitaries, Singapore state dignitaries around there. They made that into a short documentary that they showed to North Koreans about the greatness of their leaders. So with control of the media in North Korea, they're going to be able to wrap this however they want.
So that was a very rapid change. Now, some pundits say that Pyongyang's softening stance carries the aim of lifting sanctions and signing a formal peace treaty to officially end the Korean War. So, Brian, how do you suppose the process by which a peace treaty is signed will be carried out?
Well, a peace treaty is possible, people. I mean, when we talk about reunification, that's kind of a long-term process. There is a short-term path towards a peace treaty if there is some sort of real progress on the nuclear front. I don't think the U.S. is totally opposed to it. I do think that there would be some discussion about a reduction of military force, but that would probably also involve a reduction of North Korean conventional forces as well.
Sure.
So I do think it's very possible. It doesn't cost the U.S. much to do it. It doesn't cost South Korea much to do it, to sign this, unless there are some real restrictions on the U.S. military presence in Korea.
Okay. So in line with the notion of showing sincere efforts to dismantle its nuclear program before we discuss a formal peace treaty, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the Trump administration hoped to complete, quote, major disarmament of North Korea before the end of President Donald Trump's first term in office. So Brian, you gave us some timeline there. Do you think this is feasible, Fabian?
We heard many skepticism about North Korea's will to denuclearize, but Trump has this one last card in his hand, and that's the keeping up the sanctions. And on the same way, showing North Korea what economic achievements there are to be made. Actually, the key factor is if Trump can find a compromise. This term "sieve it," I think it's counterproductive, because an irreversible denuclearization, that's not going to happen, and how to define that. But for example, maybe there could be something like North Korea will give up 50% of its nuclear arsenal. That would be already a major achievement, and then you go from there. I think there will be something like that.
Now, 50% would definitely be notable progress.
And actually, the new definition in the Trump administration is final, fully verifiable denuclearization. They've moved off of CVID and already come up with their own term for it, and that might open the door for a different definition of what denuclearization is, and not the really intrusive inspection regime that maybe was envisioned by the previous administrations. So in terms of encouraging North Korea really for significant disarmament, I don't see that happening within Donald Trump's term. He's probably even going to be looking toward other things himself as he struggles to get reelected, maybe a little bit more focus on the economy. And then in his second term, which is the case with most US presidents, they look for a foreign policy legacy in their second term, and we might see more movement on the North Korea-US front then.
Okay. Now, going back to the July survey conducted by the Ministry of Sports, Culture and Tourism, the majority of South Korean public identified the US as the most important contributor to the nation's security. Thomas, what do you think is the reasoning behind this?
The reasoning, well, there's 28,000 U.S. troops here. I mean, the long-standing alliance since the end of the war, and yeah, I think obviously there have been flare-ups in the past of anti-American sentiment, or some sort of resistance to the troops being based here, and there's certainly a valid question of how many need to be here and how that should change if the peace process goes forward. But I think it's undeniable to a large extent that the U.S. military presence here has facilitated at least the economic expansion that South Korea has been able to enjoy post-war. So I think it's there as a security blanket, perhaps, that people are used to for now. But I guess we'll see, if those perceptions change as this, the threat of North Korea is diminished.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the component of South Koreans who have studied in the U.S. I think South Korea is like the #1 country for sending students to the U.S. So I think there's a lot of exposure to the U.S. and between the two cultures, and so I don't think there is that separation that there is with many other countries.
I'm going to have to, step in here and offer another perspective from my American colleagues. I think a lot of South Koreans would blame the United States for the separation of Korea and suggest that the U.S. security blanket is something that's not even required any longer. Even American analysts in the U.S. military will tell you that South Korea can defend itself. So that feeling that South Koreans have about requiring the U.S. to defend it from North Korea is a misguided one that's now being thrown off by more and more analysts as time passes. When we look at the military infrastructure and the military capability of North Korea, it's insignificant regardless of the number of troops that they have. Most analysts, again, will tell you North Korea can't invade South Korea and capture the country, even if the U.S. isn't involved that seriously in defending South Korea. And without the 28,500 troops on the Korean Peninsula, the U.S. could still step in with aircraft carriers or move whatever is required to defend the Korean Peninsula.
Thomas, you had something to add?
I would just also add that there's a regional component to the
Yes.
U.S. military presence here, combined with the troops in Japan that may end up being a reason for saying, okay, even if North Korea is kind of removed as a threat, we have China looming in the neighborhood, and there's kind of a regional geopolitics that also has to be considered.
Okay, so let's talk about those U.S. troops in South Korea. On August 13th, Donald Trump signed the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA for short, which restricts the administration from decreasing troops in South Korea to less than 22,000. What will become of the U.S. troops in South Korea post-reunification if and when that takes place?
Well, that's, I can talk about the German case. Actually, they kept the military presence in Germany, and whether it's a good thing or bad thing is not only debated in Germany, but also in the US, but maybe we talk about that later. I think probably they will keep a minimum of US troops in South Korea or in the Korean Peninsula nevertheless, but probably it will be reduced. That's what I think is highly likely.
Okay. So, Fabian, if we have a look at Germany, it's been around 30 years since Germany reunified, yet the US still maintains a strong military presence in the country. If we have a look at a recent survey there in Germany, 4 out of 10 Germans were in favor of a US troop withdrawal, outnumbering those who want the US military to stay. Why did the US maintain troops in Germany after reunification?
So when we look at the history, the Allied forces, they came as occupying forces after the Second World War, and then soon they became allies in this Cold War conflict, keeping, for example, my home city, West Berlin, a small island in the east, keeping it alive and protecting it from getting invaded by the Soviet troops, for example. So I think many people in Germany still remember that and are pretty grateful for that. After the unification, there were still concerns about some military intervention by Russia. Not so much, the fear was not so much by Germany, but let's say Poland and Latvian country. They have a very complicated history against Russia. So the US troops stayed in Germany also to protect the European security agenda. On the other hand, and that's the problematic part, the US has a strategic interest to keep troops in Europe also because of their wars in the Middle East. So for example, in some Air Force base in Germany, they would send their fighters there, getting tanked up, getting the gasoline, and then fly to, let's say, Iraq, a war that Germany was against. And also they would fly drones to Pakistan. Again, some things that most Germans would say that's really problematic. And also Americans, they have nuclear weapons stationed in Germany. And I think during the recent years, also with Trump and all this, I think the anti-Americanism is on the rise, and that's also reflected when people don't like the US presence there anymore. But on the other hand, actually many Americans also say, why should we finance the security agenda of Europe? So it's not so black and white, I think. Yeah.
Okay, let's have a look at a completely different scenario right now. According to some observers, if reunification does not happen on the Korean Peninsula, one possible scenario would be that North Korea gets administered by China. Ueno, do you see this as a realistic possibility?
Well, in realistic, I think there is very, very little possibility China absorb the North Korea, because China already has more than 1 billion people in the country itself. So if they absorb the North Korea, it's going to make China very, very difficult to govern all the ethnics. And the other reason is that geographically, North Korea is a kind of barrier against the United States or maybe South Korea and Japan. for China. So if the barrier going out and they have to keep United States away by China itself, it's going to be a big problem. It's going to cost China a lot. So I think it's not realistic to absorb North Korea by China.
Okay. Well, staying with China, the ongoing trade war between the US and China is just one bone of contention between the two countries among a host of issues, including territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Do you believe that the ongoing tensions between US and China will have a spillover effect onto inter-Korean relations and perhaps hinder any potential chances of reunification?
Yeah, I believe they will and are having an impact already. I mean, there's certainly, if there's going to be a peace treaty, China and the U.S. have to be at the same table. But beyond that, there's multiple interests at play that have, we've already seen playing out with, the U.S. military presence here. China's, opposed to that. China has been expanding its own presence within this entire region greatly, and so I just think there's many opportunities of conflict points with the U.S. and China down the road, and where that plays into the South and North Korean issue is going to be probably multiple ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's already reports of China informally easing sanctions on North Korea as the U.S. is engaging in a trade war with China. So there's a real question on how long and to what extent China will continue to enforce these sanctions in the near future.
And I think it would be kind of ironic with China, easing up on the sanctions, and then if it's called upon by North Korea and the U.S. to sit down and sign a formal peace treaty, they might not be on board with that, as that would be a big win for the U.S. So they might say, well, if you want us to be on board on the peace treaty, then we want some relief in terms of the tariffs. So it's really a complicated situation. It's like, explained in political science terms, upper structure, lower structure. You have those countries, the superpowers, that are really, in a way, dictating the terms and the degree to which North and South Korea can engage and solve the problems here.
Mm-hmm. Which brings me to my last question. As we've constantly mentioned throughout today's talk, reunification of Korea cannot be achieved by the two Koreas alone. It needs cooperation and support from the regional powers. So what can the two Koreas do to garner more support and cooperation from the neighboring countries on its road to reunification?
Well, first of all, Moon Jae-in has to basically ease the US, that they're on the same page. We've heard the skepticism that, for example, with his speech at the Independence Day, he was basically turning the whole page around and basically trying to get an economic cooperation before denuclearization. But actually, he didn't explicitly say that. I think there's also a legitimate interpretation that Moon Jae-in just is trying to show North Korea what they can achieve after denuclearization.
우리의 생존과 번영을 위해 반드시 분단을 극복해야 합니다. 정치적 통일은 멀었더라도 남북 간의 평화를 정착시키고 자유롭게 오가며 하나의 경제 공동체를 이루는 것, 그것이 우리에게 진정한 광복입니다.
So we'll have to see how that unfolds, but I think that's the main factor that South Korea should make clear that we are all on the same page, we have the same interest.
Okay, so Pham, do you have any ideas on what the two Koreas can do to garner more support from the neighboring countries regards to reunification?
I think that the two Koreas need to work together to design a roadmap, a programs, economics program, cooperation program, and to show that they are very suitable for them to develop the whole Korean Peninsula and on the countries, things that can believe that it is feasible, and they need to have the two Koreas. Yeah.
Okay, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your insight. Thank you very much for joining me. Thank you. Now, 2018 has so far brought the two Koreas closer to their eventual goal of reunification. Hopefully, the two sides will continue on with their steady dialogue on this matter and build a solid foundation from which to achieve peaceful reunification. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.